We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast. Welcome to Blue Skies. Today we're fortunate to have a guest who's a distinguished Canadian and I'm proud to call a friend. He's a lawyer, a former cabinet minister, a former diplomat, a business leader, a thought leader, a husband, a father, a proud Albertan, and I can say from having stayed at his house, a fantastic chef as well. We've got Gary Marr on the program with us today, and he's the president of the Canada West Foundation and has been the CEO of the foundation since April of 2020. Previous to that, he worked directly in the energy sector as president and CEO of the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. And that came after a distinguished and long career as a public servant, both as an elected official and a diplomatic role for his province. He was an MLA in Alberta from 1993 to 2007. He served in all of the key portfolios, really, and was known as a competent minister that you wanted on file. Community development, health, education, the two biggies provincially, environment, and international relations for Alberta. Many of us and many Albertans call him the best premier Alberta never had. You know, a term that sometimes I've heard recently as well. After that time in public office, he served in a diplomatic function as the representative for Alberta in Washington from 2007 to 2011, and in Asia from 2011 to 2015, looking out for the provincial issues, working closely with Canada's diplomatic corps, and really making sure that there was capital investment and global awareness of the energy and agriculture potential for Alberta. So today, we're very fortunate to blue sky Western issues with the Honourable Gary Marr. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, Erin.
Well, I know we're going to have a good conversation because you are known to be a happy warrior in politics and a bit of a policy wonk, but a cool policy wonk, I will say. Let's start out because I know a lot of my listeners would be in the Laurentian region, to quote Bricker and Ibbotson here, and they may not be familiar with the Canada West Foundation and the work you're doing. So give us a few minutes on the origins of the Canada West Foundation and its purpose and your mission today.
The Canada West Foundation is one of Canada's oldest public policy think tanks. We've been around for more than half a century. Started in 1971. There were four Western Canadians who decided that the interests of Canada's four Western provinces were not being considered as deeply as they ought to have been by a central Canadian government. And so the Honourable James Richardson, who was a Liberal cabinet minister, together with three Albertans, the Mannix family, the Arthur Childs group, and also oh goodness gracious, I've forgotten the fourth one now. They put together a pool of money to decide to create the Canada West Foundation, which was intended to promote policies that promote the West, and by extension, all of Canada. So a strong West within a strong Canada. And so we've been on that mission for the last 50 years. We have three major centers that we focus on in terms of our public policy: natural resources, human capital, and trade and trade investment. So it's really a remarkable. It's got a remarkable history, and continues our good work in these areas. And we comment on a lot of things that you've commented on as well, Erin, in terms of things that are important to Canada. It may be on energy, it may be on agriculture, it may be on the Indo-Pacific strategy. There are a whole host of things that we cover, and most notably, as you've recently written about, the whole issue in the federal budget about major project infrastructure being completed. So that's a broad summary. We do a lot of stuff. We've got a team of about 20 people, and we are small but extremely devoted to our craft.
You are, and some of the public policy ideas and proposals you put forward are very thoughtful and very highly regarded. And you're coming to Ontario. You're in Edmonton right now, the city of champions, and you're coming to Toronto. So already working with Premier Ford and other provinces on advancing a mandate. As you said, strong Western Canada means a strong, united, and prosperous Canada. Let's look at that timeline, though, Gary, because what's interesting, so Canada West Foundation stood up in 1971 to address already perceived, lack of awareness, lack of understanding in the center of Canada with respect to the needs of Western Canada. But look at the timeline since then. We had the rise of the Reform Party and the West Wants in the 80s and 90s. Today, in the last 5-6 years, we've had Wexit, we've had kind of separation movements. Now we have a large debate about autonomy and maybe Alberta and Saskatchewan going solo on few things and squabbling over Section 91, 92 of the Constitution. I raised alienation in Western Canada in my first meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau as opposition leader, and the Globe and Mail largely mocked that concept. Is that because even with these efforts, there's still such an approach to national public policy making from the perspective of the Laurentian elite of Ontario and Quebec? And have you been able to counter some of this disaffection, or what's your view on the state of Western alienation, and is it real, and what can we do as Canadians to help address it?
Well, let me say this. The sense that I think particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, to a lesser degree British Columbia, has with respect to how the federal government operates is this. If we were to drive from Windsor to Quebec City, the majority of Canadians live in that corridor. And the sense that people in Alberta and Saskatchewan have is that if you have a government that's focused on electoral success, they're focusing their policies where the majority of Canadians reside. They're not looking at the country as a whole. And yet there's good examples of that. Take, for example, when the federal government decided to go forward with the CETA agreement, a free trade agreement with Europe, the major partners to that would come from central Canada. So the federal government actually did a deep dive economic analysis as to what the economic outcomes and opportunities would be if they signed CETA. Once they signed CETA, then they did a deep dive analysis into the kind of infrastructure that was required to breathe life into the free trade agreement. By comparison, if you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, your listeners will recall that the Prime Minister nearly walked away from the TPP, leaving Prime Minister Shinzo Abe waiting for a meeting in Tokyo. They never did an economic analysis of what it would mean to be a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The work was actually done by the Canada West Foundation. And based on the strength of the data, I think that's what persuaded the federal government to come back to be a member of the TPP. And it's notable that the largest economic impact from the TPP would have been with the 4 Western provinces, which are huge net exporters to the region, whereas Ontario and Quebec are net importers from that region. And so there's a big difference. And then after the Canadian government came back to join the TPP, there's no analysis done on the trade infrastructure required. Again, ports, roads, bridges, rail, pipelines, LNG, and so on, to be able to breathe life into the TPP. So that was done by the Canada West Foundation. We continue to work on the idea of building a national trade infrastructure, having a plan for Canada that looks at projects that are shovel-worthy as opposed to merely being shovel-ready. And so we continue to work, and we continue to hope to have influence on policy. The most recent piece that's similar to the TPP is the whole Indo-Pacific strategy, which I know you've also written about.
Yes. Well, listen, your work, I really became a fan of Canada West Foundation when I was Parliamentary Secretary for Trade working on the TPP, as you said, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I went to Seoul for our first free trade agreement in Asia, which was with South Korea, as you remember. And getting access for Alberta beef was our critical trade objective because Australia was there first, and we were seeing us lose market share. You mentioned walking away from the TPP. People may forget Prime Minister Trudeau actually didn't show up to the meeting, to the leaders' meeting in Vietnam, and that's where Shinzo Abe, as you said, was extremely upset with Canada. But also headlines in Australia, New Zealand, usually our closest friends, Five Eyes, saying what's happened to Canada. We did engage and we did sign on, and he'll refer to it as the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trade Agreement. But at the end of the day, the essentials were already previously negotiated by the Conservatives. And as you said, that infrastructure that's needed to access the Indo-Pacific and to see really our Pacific future is in the future going to eclipse our Atlantic history as an Atlantic, as a NATO, as the linchpin, as Churchill called us, between Europe and North America. We put in more port infrastructure in Vancouver, but Canadians always hear about the grain shipment challenges on our rail lines. Like, are we so inadequately prepared to take advantage of this Pacific trade pivot, in your view?
So a couple of pieces I'll say, first of all. Canadians should be asking, is there a role for Canada to help make the world a safer, more secure, and greener place? If Canadians think that the answer is yes, then there's three things that Canada's really, really good at that can contribute to that. It's fuel, it's fertilizer, and it's food. Those three things, Canada really has tremendous capacity. Now, with respect to our infrastructure, as I said earlier, if you can't move it, you can't sell it. I mean, this is really important to note that in 2011, the World Economic Forum did a review of the reliability of trade infrastructure. They surveyed customers all over the world. Canada has gone from being 11th in the world to number 32 in terms of trade reliability. And that's not us saying that. That's the people that, that are our customers saying that. And very little has been done with respect to the federal government's sort of acknowledgement of this issue. The United States, by comparison, has dropped, I think, from number 12 to number 14, and they are spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on their infrastructure. Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation in the U.S., is making announcements all over the place saying we are upgrading, our rail, our roads, our ports, our airports, and so on and so forth, in order to make sure that we're not behind. And we've got to keep track of what's happening in the United States because they're not just our biggest trade partner; they're also our biggest trade competitor. And so we've got to really follow what goes on in the United States in order to keep pace with what they're doing, so that we can breathe life into all of the opportunities that Canada has. For example, working in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, no, you say that about the U.S. I love how you phrased it. They are our closest trading partner, our closest security ally, but they are our competitor on all major fronts. When we had the NAFTA negotiation, you may recall the Trudeau government, Ms. Freeland in particular, had the so-called progressive trade agenda, where they were going to talk about all these non-trade issues, social issues, in the context of negotiations with President Trump. What the Conservatives, and I was the critic, advocated for was energy, auto, and transportation. Make it easier to move goods around North America, a fortress North America approach. We were already talking about the changing regulatory standard in terms of EV and emissions for vehicles. Look at all those issues are the top issues that Biden's talking about. And we had an opportunity to be first mover in the renegotiation of NAFTA, but the Liberals couldn't resist the virtue signaling. And the media, which unfortunately was more focused on Trump as the negotiation opponent, as opposed to what was Canada's strategic issue or interests, claimed we got a good deal when it was actually disastrous from a competitive standpoint for Canada. So I loved how you said fuel, fertilizer, and food. Let's talk about the strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for Western Canada. SWOT analysis. Take us through those. Obviously, fuel, energy, LNG, decarbonizing globally needs to have Canadian LNG at the forefront for the next several decades. Then we can see nuclear and a whole range of other technologies also being a part of that. But I think let's leave that for the third thing you'll discuss. Talk about fertilizer and food first, because I don't think a lot of folks in my area, in the Durham region, would understand how critical Canadian products and Canadian commodities are for the global food security and global agriculture.
Well, I have a theory, and that theory is that every country in the world is just a few missed meals away from the start of a revolution. I mean, I would refer people to the Arab Spring, starting over the price of food in a market in Tunisia. And so Canada is one of the few countries in the world that is food secure. That is to say, we produce more food than we consume. So we are net exporters of food by a wide margin. And if you look at, a lot of our exports to, throughout the world, commodities are an important part of it. Value added is an increasingly important part of it. But look at our grains, look at canola, look at wheat, look at pulses that go from Saskatchewan to India. We are a food superpower. And associated with that, in agriculture, it's not just food and value-added products. It's also skills and technology and equipment that we export as well. There's a great story from southern Saskatchewan. The Member of Parliament, Jeremy Patzer, worked on a bipartisan basis with, then Minister Navdeep Bains to make sure that the agricultural equipment business was really, really robust. And we nearly lost that business because of an attempt by, U.S. authorities to create a monopoly by locking out Canadian equipment from the computers of, tractors like John Deere's. So we've got a great story to tell in terms of our exports. It is a big, big part of our GDP on agriculture, and there's a growing demand. And particularly in places like Asia, where there is a growing middle class, that growing middle class not only demands more food, they demand different types of food. Increasingly, as you move up into the middle class, you're demanding more proteins, not just grains. And so if you look at our protein exports of beef and pork that comes from Manitoba, this is an important part of our exports, and goes to the view that if Canada wants to help make this a more secure, safe world, food is going to be a very important part of it. And look at what happened to places in Africa, when grain shipments from Ukraine were suddenly shut down. Ukraine is a huge producer of wheat, but the invasion of Ukraine and the stoppage of grain shipments coming from there had a profound impact on nations that relied on that grain, and sent them scrambling. And this is, again, particularly in Africa, to try and find supply. Canada can be an important part of helping make this a safer, more secure world if we have the ability to get our products to market.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted something that years ago, when we were looking at food security issues, we didn't factor in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is another agricultural powerhouse. You talked about Africa and Middle East, countries like Egypt that were scrambling because most of their food sources came from Ukraine. Canada has the ability to step in. I also found when we were doing TPP negotiations and I went to South Korea, as you said, not only is there more of a demand in that growing middle class, tens of millions in the Indo-Pacific joining the middle class each year. They also want to source it from countries that have strong regulatory measures so that the food is trusted. And it's great, like Canadian beef, pork in markets in Asia. And when China had the swine flu, they were forced to cave on blocking of pork exports during the Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei incident, because they were, as you said, in China, a few missed meals away from instability on the ground. Are these markets really the future for ag in the growing Indo-Pacific? And we're already a big player. Can we really make serious gains if we can get the infrastructure built for trade to reach those markets?
Well, let's look at the federal government's 26-page Indo-Pacific strategy. They list 40 countries in it, but I wouldn't be quite that ambitious. The countries they list include North Korea. So I would look at the 16 economies that Canada really could play a role in, as opposed to the 40 countries that are listed. So the short answer is yes. I mean, we have opportunity there, but it's not just about improving market access to new countries. It's also about surviving market access. And so we've seen non-tariff barriers come up in other places, including the United States. People would recall back in 2006, something called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSC, which was more commonly called mad cow disease. There was really not much scientific basis for the United States putting up a non-tariff barrier on Canadian beef exports to the United States. But eventually the issue was overcome by the fact that the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, Secretary Johans, had been a former governor and had been a friend of Ralph Klein's. And so on a subnational government basis, sometimes solutions can be found subnationally, and that's what reopened the beef markets to the United States from Canada, was this personal relationship. And so we shouldn't, not everything needs to be done by the federal government in this regard, but provinces working with their state counterparts can make a difference. The United States, as we've said, is our largest trade partner, but 38 U.S. states describe Canada as being their largest export market. So there is really a great relationship there. We've seen non-tariff barriers put up on canola in China. We've seen non-tariff barriers put up in India. We can learn something from the Australians in this regard. They are very proactive about trying to identify and head off at the pass, as it were, NTBs that come up from other countries that are their markets. We should probably be doing the same thing. So should we be looking at all 16 economies that are part of the Indo-Pacific? Probably not. We should prioritize them, which are the most important ones, and really focus on them, and also be proactive about making sure that we can deal with non-tariff barriers and survive market access, not just create more market access.
Yeah, no, and that perspective of being the former representative of Alberta and Washington has given you insight on how important those subnational relationships are, state to state, province to state, to advance the national interest, and you were a key part of that. So let's go to the second F now, fertilizer. Many Canadians might know about potash and our strength as one of the major producers, but how is there an opportunity here? Because Russia is the key player in terms of global fertilizer, and that's a critical part of food security. And in fact, there's some people like Peter Zeihan and other geopolitical strategists warning about we haven't seen the food insecurity yet because Russia will ramp up their trade restrictions and their export restrictions this summer, he believes. And there could be increased scarcity of fertilizer. So you're going to see reduced yield in the countries that can trade. How can Canada step up here and play a key role and and raise our GDP at the same time?
So it really is a tremendous opportunity, but it does require trade infrastructure to be able to move what we can produce and get it to markets reliably. And so is there anything that we can do in the short term? Maybe not, but I mean, let's not miss out the opportunity over the medium and long term by being short-sighted, would be my view. So being able to move potash, being able to move the things that we produce is not only good for Canada, economically, it's good for the world and helps contribute to a more peaceful and secure world. So are there things that we can do in the short run? Maybe not. Are there things that we can do in the medium and long term? The answer is yes, but it requires a more immediate and urgent need to deal with tie-ups in our infrastructure. And you've already commented that people that listen to your podcast in Central Canada, they might have heard of things like tie-ups for grain shipments or other rail transportation or trying to move commodities to marketplaces. That problem is real. And to me, I noted in your in your commentary that your mom said, if you can't say something nice, don't say it at all. My mom gave me the same advice. And so I'll say this about the federal government's budget in broad terms. There was a lot of spending there, but not much sense of how you create the revenue to be able to afford that spending. And so it does strike me that I give the federal government credit for one thing, which is taking the lead on trying to knock down interprovincial trade barriers within Canada. If we didn't have such barriers, economists estimate that could result in a boost of 3 to 4%, on the GDP of Canada. That's a good thing. And then if we actually focused on trade infrastructure, we could also increase our GDP. Now, by increasing the GDP, you increase the revenue that is available to government. And so I would say as a priority, you should be paying for the things, you should be paying for the infrastructure that grows the GDP, that creates the revenue, that allows you to pay for the things that you want to put money into, be it healthcare, be it education, being support for people who are, that are in need of support in our country. But grow the GDP, invest in the infrastructure that grows that GDP to be able to create the revenue to pay for the things that Canadians really want and need.
Well said. And long term, the increasing that infrastructure, really creating reliable trade corridors, allows us to ramp things up over time, and it will consistently raise GDP over time, particularly as the Indo-Pacific continues to grow. And right now, we're still not equipped to take really advantage of that market. Okay, let's talk about the last F, the most important, really, for the strength of the economy in Western Canada and Canada. I often say the global slowdown of 2008, 2009, and the years afterwards, the only thing that kept Canada above water and really leaving the G7 was the strength of energy prices in that time frame, and the billions in net contribution from Alberta, from Saskatchewan, and Manitoba a little bit, over time has meant that our energy sector is such a net positive for the country. Yet the policies out of Ottawa in recent years have tried to discourage growth in that sector, prevent market access if you're looking at pipeline cancellations. How is that issue specifically related to the alienation? And we can talk a little bit about the budget in a minute, but Bill C-69, which was changes to impact assessment, which is not just environmental review, but also social review. And we remember Prime Minister Trudeau talking about, those dozens of construction men in rural parts of the country and the risks they were to communities, it got to a sense that I think many Westerners felt that the rules were being set so high and so difficult to overcome that it was really an effort to stop or to shut down the oil sands, which even some of the MPs and ministers in the Trudeau government had advocated for before they became politicians. So is that change to environmental and impact assessment really the key element of this latest wave of alienation, whether it Wexit, whether it separation? And do you see any effort to change that? I know that's a lot there, but I've in my travels in Western Canada, and why I launched my second leadership in Alberta was to address just this sense that Ottawa was holding the region back.
I think that's certainly part of it. I think that, the federal government is focused only on meeting their targets under the Paris Accord. And there's no understanding that while the energy sector is a large contributor, the largest sector contributor to GHGs in the country, it's also where the solutions emanate from. So, I think it's really notable to go back to my original sort of thesis that Canada can play a role in making this not only a safer, more secure world, but also a greener world. There were 162 new coal-fired power plants approved in China in 2022. And, if we were able to move LNG from Canada to, particularly to Asia, we could dramatically reduce the GHG emissions in the global atmosphere. There's no Canadian atmosphere, there's no Alberta atmosphere, but there is a global atmosphere. And if you can use it to displace coal, depending on the sector, it could be textiles, it could be electricity, it could be chemical industry, that you can reduce the GHGs in China by taking Canadian LNG there and reduce their emissions by between 32 and 60%. And this would be a significant improvement, because even if we shut down all GHGs coming from Canada, it wouldn't make up for the 162 power plants that are going to be running coal in China, in the next 12 to 18 months. So this is part of the reason why LNG is important. And when you look at oil, let's look at the world's largest, reserves in the world. Number one, Venezuela. Number two, Saudi Arabia. Number three, Canada, followed by Iran, Iraq, and the Russian Federation. By my count, there's only one Western liberal democracy of the group. And if you look at
it's the rogues gallery in Canada, right? And so where would you get not only certainty for capital and low political risk in this age of ESG, environmental social governance? That's the only country in there that you can trust on any of those measures.
That's what are called reserves. I would argue that Canada has the number one body of reserves in the world that you can audit. So let's start with that. I think that, if you look at the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, if you look at the International Energy Agency out of Paris, they all say, and it doesn't matter whose analysis, we're going to be using fossil fuels for a long time, like decades from now. So that leads me to what the Prime Minister said when Chancellor Scholz was here looking for LNG. He said, I haven't seen a business case for LNG. Well, Chancellor Scholz might suggest otherwise. When Prime Minister Kishida from Japan was in Ottawa, he was asking for the same thing. We've seen the same requests for LNG out of the presidents of South Korea. So is there a business case? Well, first of all, I'd say it's actually not the Prime Minister's job to determine if there is a business case. That's the private sector's job to determine, are we going to be using LNG or fossil fuels into 2050, 2060, 2070? And then they can make the decisions about whether or not there's a business case and whether they should invest billions of dollars in an LNG facility off the west coast of British Columbia. And so the Prime Minister has offered up hydrogen. We don't have any hydrogen plants here in Canada yet. But it does strike me that if you want to be a trusted supplier of future energy like hydrogen, you better be a trusted supplier of the energy that's available today, like LNG or like oil. And so to go back to your question about, is this part of the angst that Western Canadians feel about being alienated, they get the sense that the federal government doesn't really understand or appreciate the role that the energy sector can play in terms of, one, lowering GHG emissions throughout the world, and two, the fact that we do it from a place that is a democratic country that has ESG characteristics that are quite different than the other major supplies of oil in the world. And so I think that this is a partial contribution to Western alienation. Maybe the other part of it is that there is, and there are, and you as a lawyer would have studied constitutional law. I mean, interestingly, I studied constitutional law under Anne McClellan, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and there are divisions of power under our Constitution. And so a second cause of angst for Western Canadians is that the federal government, and you can see this in the whole Supreme Court of Canada decision, there is an encroachment on provincial heads of power that are laid out in the Constitution. This also creates angst for Western Canadians. They might not frame it that way, but there is a sense that the federal government treats the provinces like mere stakeholders and not real partners in confederation. And the case laid out by the lawyers for the government of Canada before the Supreme Court really didn't talk about heads of power. They talked about how we've evolved into a cooperative federalism. Well, I don't recall any single Canadian that got a vote on that kind of constitutional change. And that's the sort of thing that, again, Canadians might not frame it that way, but they get a sense of it, that there's been a change that they don't like, even if they're not experts on the Constitution. And that gives Western Canadians some angst. And it should give all Canadians some angst that the federal government seems to say, well, if we say it's our jurisdiction, then it's our jurisdiction. That's not how the Constitution reads.
Yes, and I think of all federal governments, Justin Trudeau's federal government has been the most paternalistic with respect to this. There is a sense that the federal government is the parent and the provincial governments are somehow the children, and the tone and the plan will be set by the federal government, when actually, if you respect sections 91 and 92, our federation was forged to make sure that there was distinct domain, and you were a former health minister, and education, two key parts of provincial jurisdiction, but there was a range of areas of shared jurisdiction. And shared jurisdiction does not mean the federal government tells the other jurisdiction what to do and they therefore work together. It has to be a way of combining on that. And certainly there are impacts from pollution and other things going back, 30 years in the Supreme Court jurisprudence. But now that we have an approach to lower our greenhouse gas emissions, and I think there's public good in that, it has to be done collaboratively, respecting shared jurisdiction and respecting the economic potential of regions of the country. That can't be robbed from them in a regulatory burden. So it's been interesting to see, this issue evolve. And as you said, Canada's potential to play a global leadership role. I've had Chris Sublicki, who you may know from Western Canada, on my podcast. Even my most recent one, James Sconiac, he's from Bruce Power, talking about nuclear and the potential for LNG, nuclear energy, and renewables. Like Canada and our technology and our skill set could be a major player, because when Ontario reduced its coal burning for electricity generation, as you said, in the time frame that Ontario took its, I think, 8 gigawatts off the system, 10 times that went on the system from new coal generation in China, in Indonesia especially. And so where can, the West, the global North, where can the advanced countries play a role in technology and then play a role in lower carbon emission energy? And as you said, Canada as the ESGI superpower, the one that is also engaging Indigenous communities as partners, we should be the preferred energy source for the West and for growing countries that want to take climate change seriously. So listen, on the budget, you read my piece and you referenced it. I did say good things about the budget, especially Blake Richards and Todd Doherty's measures on the suicide prevention hotline and leave for parents who lose an infant stillborn or just before birth. So there were some good measures in the budget. But the secret page of the budget that you and I have talked about, page 92, seems to be, we're not going to get this really one, but getting major projects done. And I just ran into Harold Calla from the First Nation Major Projects Coalition on the weekend, and we were talking about page 92. This is almost $1.5 billion in expenditures meant at expediting impact assessment and project review. Expediting it after Bill C-69 from 2019 slowed down the process. So do you see this as a turning point where even the Liberal government realizes they went way too far and that capital has fled, projects are kind of held up, and that push that Biden gave us on the critical minerals side will actually have positive impacts for everything from energy development to pipeline
this is something
approvals?
that we're working on very hard at Canada West Foundation. I mean, we've followed the Supreme Court of Canada case on Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. Regardless of what the Supreme Court decides, there will have to be changes made to the act. I think, the Supreme Court could say everything's fine. The Supreme Court could say, well, this part is fine, but this part needs changes. Or the court, unlikely outcome is they could say, well, it's unconstitutional. But in all three circumstances, there will need to be changes to the legislation. It seems fairly clear that would the Ring of Fire resources be developed in Ontario under the current piece of legislation? The answer is probably not. And the reason why it is important to be able to move more quickly on this is because we're not the only place in the world that has critical minerals. And there are other places in the world that could say, you know what, we have that opportunity to supply the United States or other countries with critical minerals that are necessary for moving forward on electrification of the economy and reducing GHGs as a consequence of that. So there is some urgency, and I think page 92. I'm going to read out of what you said. I think you said that it was like a word salad of progressive terms. I mean, I think if you and I were to take a chat GPT and plug that in, we'd probably get about the same kind of outcome that the federal government put into this. And I do concern myself with this. And I make this observation that, and I'm a nonpartisan, but, I have to be able to make observations about how governments operate. And good governments, in my view, should spend the majority of their time thinking about, testing, evaluating, planning, and executing good public policy, and about 25% of their time sort of retail marketing the same. But if you've got a government that has those proportions in reverse, that they spend all their time telling you what they're going to do and spending very little time figuring out how they're going to do it, that's how you end up with pieces of legislation like Bill C-69. It was ambitious in terms of its progressive measures and outcomes that were being sought, but not much time spent on the practical aspects of, will you be able to get anything done under these circumstances? And it strikes me that the Canada West Foundation was, deeply involved in making submissions to the federal government on the regulations and the legislation before it was passed. And there were actually some really good measures that could have been done to, mitigate the concerns that you have with respect to how the bill operated. But imagine being, say, a mining company, and it takes 16 years on average for you to get your permit approved. Let's assume that we want to have all electric vehicles by 2035. So let's get started today on our mine that's going to produce the material that is going to be used in those batteries. We've already run out of time. We won't get it done in time for 2035, which leaves Canada sort of buying critical minerals from other parts of the world instead of developing them ourselves. So it's I would agree with your view that that the federal government to some degree has come to a recognition. In page 92, there's an admission that the Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, has to make changes. And I certainly encourage the federal government. First of all, it's never hard to admit that you're wrong, but having done so, I give them credit for that and hope that they'll do something that's sensible so that we can produce the things that we need, whether it's nuclear out of Saskatchewan, SMRs that can play an important role in the future, LNG even. I mean, one of the biggest producers of GHGs in the world was the United States, and they did it by converting coal to natural gas. In Canada, about 82% of our electricity already comes from non-emitting sources, but there are parts of the country that don't have hydropower the way that they do in Ontario and British Columbia and Quebec. If you were in Nova Scotia, almost all your electricity comes from burning coal. And so I think that going back to your point on the Constitution, we as Canadians often talk about our diversity of people as being a great strength. We don't often talk about the diversity of our natural resources also being a great strength, and it is. And whether it's oil and gas that comes from northeastern BC or Alberta or Saskatchewan, or uranium and critical minerals from Saskatchewan and potash, or whether it's coal in Nova Scotia, whether it's hydropower in Ontario, we have a great diversity of resources, and that's the reason why we can play a great role in making the world a safer and greener world.
We are kindred spirits. You almost are quoting a speech I gave years ago on Trans Mountain, on respecting our economic diversity as a country, and diversity is our strength. It's all aspects of diversity. And Bill C-69, Canada West Foundation did such good advocacy on it. It was so unnecessary to be that draconian because 9 out of 10 premiers opposed it. Industry and capital markets were warning about it. The U.S., the Wilson Center, put out a report with concern about it. And it became an ideological struggle. And I think when the Trudeau government was shut out of Saskatchewan and Alberta in 2019, they almost then just decided to not listen and to double down. So I think if page 92 of the budget represents a quiet but subtle recognition that their changes in Bill C-69 were too strong, too hard, too resolute, I think that's a good thing. Ironically, lawyers on behalf of the government defended 69 in the Supreme Court 2 weeks before this page in the budget. But maybe my mother was right. This is another good thing I can say, that even though they've used the word salad and they've tried to sort of downplay this major projects get shit done, as I said at the end of my essay, I think when our biggest customer and our friend next door is in Parliament saying, let's build the most resolute supply chain in the world for critical minerals, it's recognition that the government said, if the U.S. with the Defense Production Agreement is going to invest their billions in Canada, they better have some certainty on the return. So I want to thank you for your advocacy. I think what you've been doing and your style, Gary, is important to it. So final thing I'll say, if you had one top priority that, you know, you're well liked on all sides of the spectrum, you've got natural Alberta charm, if you were able to talk Justin Trudeau into doing one major thing quickly for Western Canada to benefit the whole country, what would that one thing be?
National Trade Infrastructure Plan. That would benefit the entire country. That would benefit the entire, and provide some sense to Western Canadians that they're being listened to, and that we are an important part of Canada. I'm a proud Canadian. I think most Western Canadians are proud Canadians, but they don't see themselves reflected in the ambitions when some $2 billion is allocated for national trade infrastructure and $12 billion is given by the federal government for subway improvements in Toronto. There are lots of people that would say that's kind of insufficient. And if you look at our major trade partners, we've got to keep pace, Prime Minister, is what I'd say. You look at countries like G7 nations, they're contributing 2 or 3 or even 4% of their GDP to national trade infrastructure. We are far, far short of that. So, I wouldn't be talking about a specific number, but I'd say a range. A range for national trade infrastructure plan, and moving from shovel ready to shovel worthy. I mean, you've got a Canada Infrastructure Bank that has left billions of dollars unspent because they can't find enough shovel-ready infrastructure projects to move forward on. That's how you end up with a national infrastructure bank spending $600,000 on a skateboard park in Gabriola Island. I mean, if there was anything that would trivialize the importance of infrastructure, that would be it.
Yeah. Well, the Infrastructure Bank and partnerships with First Nations are on page 92 of the budget, Gary. So I think there's recognition that even with the Infrastructure Bank, they have not been serious. The world needs more Canada from an economic and climate change standpoint. Fuel, fertilizer, and food, the 3 Fs that you championed earlier. And to get that Canadian expertise and those products and services to market, we need that trade infrastructure. So great way to end. You are a proud Canadian, Gary. I can say you're a great Canadian as well. You've served in public life. You've served as a diplomat. You are known as a well-informed and thoughtful voice. So thank you for blue skying priorities for Western Canada here today with a Laurentian region Ontario MP here on Blue Skies.
Me, Erin, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Can't wait. And thank you for blue skying this. If you want any more information on the subjects we've talked about, check out the website and check out the Canada West Foundation, and make sure we build a strong and united Canada for every single part of this great country.